In 1945, the first atomic bomb detonated in the New Mexico desert. The man who built it, J. Robert Oppenheimer, watched the fireball rise and quoted a line from an ancient Hindu scripture written thousands of years earlier. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Years later, a student asked him whether the Trinity test was the first nuclear detonation in history. His answer was strange. He said, "Well, yes, in modern times." In modern times, as if there had been another time. 4,000 kilometers away, in the ruins of an ancient city in modern-day Pakistan, there are skeletons lying in the streets, flattened where they fell, some still holding hands, and the ground around them, according to some accounts, carries radiation levels that no one has been able to fully explain. The ancient texts of the region describe a weapon that rose like 10,000 suns and reduced an entire civilization to ash. Today, we ask the question no historian wants to answer. Was there a nuclear war on Earth thousands of years before our own? In the 1920s, archaeologists excavating in the Indus Valley uncovered the remains of a city that should not have existed. They called it Mohenjo-daro, the Mound of the Dead. It was built around 2500 BC, which makes it one of the oldest cities on Earth, contemporary with ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia. But Mohenjo-daro was not like them. It was laid out on a precise grid, straight streets crossing at right angles, a level of urban planning that would not appear again in the Western world for thousands of years. It had a sewage and drainage system more advanced than what existed in many cities in the early 20th century. Covered drains, private bathrooms, public wells, standardized fired bricks, manufactured to consistent dimensions across the entire civilization. It even had a great bath, a large watertight public pool sealed with bitumen, fed and drained by an engineered water system. Nothing else like it exists in the ancient world. It had a population estimated in the tens of thousands, and it was just one city in a civilization that stretched across an area larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. The Indus Valley Civilization, as it is now called, was one of the three great early civilizations of the ancient world. And in some ways, it was the most sophisticated of the three. Yet we know almost nothing about it. Its writing system has never been deciphered. We do not know what language they spoke, what they called themselves, who ruled them, or what they believed. And we do not know what happened to them. Because around 1900 BC, the entire civilization collapsed. The cities were abandoned. The population vanished. A culture that had thrived for centuries simply disappeared from the historical record. The mainstream explanation is climate change, shifting rivers, drought, a slow decline over generations. But the ruins of Mohenjo-daro tell a different story, a faster one, a far more violent one. When archaeologists excavated the upper levels of Mohenjo-daro, they found something that did not fit the picture of a slow, peaceful decline. They found bodies, not in graves, not in tombs, scattered in the streets, in doorways, on staircases, lying where they had fallen. Some of the skeletons were sprawled flat, face down, as if struck down instantly while going about their day. Others were found in groups. In one account, several bodies lay together, and two of them appeared to be holding hands. Whatever happened, it happened so fast that a person reaching for the hand of someone beside them never let go. The bodies showed no signs of having been buried, no signs of decay before death, no signs of having been moved. They were simply where the catastrophe found them. This is not how people die in a famine. Famine is slow. People weaken, retreat indoors, and die in their beds over weeks and months. This is not how people die in a flood. A flood leaves bodies tangled in debris, carried by water. This is how people die in an instant, all at once, caught in the open, killed where they stood before they had time to react. The British archaeologist who excavated much of the site, Mortimer Wheeler, proposed that the people had been massacred by invaders, an Aryan migration that swept into the Indus Valley and slaughtered the inhabitants. But that theory had a problem. There were no weapons found near the bodies, no arrowheads embedded in bone, no sword cuts, no signs of the close quarters violence that a massacre by invading warriors would leave behind. And there was no evidence of the invasion itself, no destroyed fortifications consistent with a siege, no burned defensive walls. The massacre theory has largely been abandoned by mainstream archaeology for lack of evidence. So we are left with the bodies, killed instantly, in the open, with no attacker, no weapons, and no explanation. And then there is the matter of what the bodies were exposed to. There is a substance that forms when sand and rock are exposed to extreme heat. The kind of heat that does not occur naturally on the surface of the Earth, except in one specific circumstance. When the heat is intense enough, sand melts, and when it cools, it hardens into glass. In 1945, after the first atomic bomb test in New Mexico, scientists found that the desert sand around Ground Zero had fused into a layer of green glass. They named it trinitite after the Trinity test. Vitrification, the transformation of Earth into glass through sudden extreme heat. And at certain ancient sites around the world, vitrification appears where it has no business being. At Mohenjo-daro, researchers have reported finding layers of the city that show signs of intense heat. Bricks and pottery fused together, sections of wall that appear to have been subjected to temperatures far beyond anything a normal fire could produce. Some researchers have estimated the temperatures required at over 1,500 degrees Celsius. For comparison, an ordinary house fire burns at around 600 to 800 degrees. A forest fire, even hotter, rarely exceeds 1,100. To reach 1,500 degrees, you need something far more powerful than fire. You need the kind of energy released by industrial furnaces, by volcanic lava, or by a nuclear detonation. And there is one more detail. At the edges of certain melted areas, the heat appears to have struck from a single direction, as if a wave of energy had washed across the city from one point, fusing everything in its path before it cooled. Then there is the radiation. According to several accounts that circulate widely in alternative archaeology, some of the skeletons recovered from Mohenjo-daro were found to be highly radioactive, among the most radioactive ever discovered, comparable to the remains found at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, this claim needs to be handled carefully. It appears repeatedly in books and documentaries, but it is difficult to trace to a peer-reviewed source. Mainstream archaeology does not accept it. But the claim refuses to die, and it sits alongside the vitrified layers, the instantly killed bodies, and the sudden collapse of the civilization, forming a pattern that, taken together, is genuinely difficult to dismiss. And Mohenjo-daro is not the only place on Earth where the ground has been turned to glass. Across Scotland, Ireland, and parts of continental Europe, there are ancient stone structures known as vitrified forts. They are hill forts, built from stone, whose walls have been subjected to such intense heat that the rock has melted and fused into glass. There are over 70 of these sites in Scotland alone. And here is the problem they pose. To melt the stone used in these forts, you need temperatures of around 1,000 to 1,100 degrees Celsius. sustained over a large area. No one has been able to convincingly reproduce the effect. Experiments to vitrify stone walls by simply burning wood against them have largely failed. The heat required is too great, too even, and too widespread to be explained by an attacking army setting fire to a wooden rampart. Something melted those walls, and whatever it was, we cannot replicate it with the explanations we currently accept. Some of these forts sit on remote hilltops with no strategic value, far from any known battlefield. There was no army to besiege them, and no obvious reason to burn them, yet the stone ran like wax. Then there is the desert glass. In the Libyan desert, in the sands of the Sahara, there are scattered pieces of pure, clear yellow-green glass, natural glass, formed from melted sand, lying in the open desert. It is so pure and so beautiful that the ancient Egyptians prized it. A piece of Libyan desert glass forms the centerpiece of a pectoral ornament found in the tomb of Tutankhamun, carved into the shape of a scarab beetle. Mainstream science attributes the Libyan desert glass to a meteorite impact or an airburst, a comet or asteroid exploding above the desert, generating a flash of heat intense enough to melt the sand below. And that is a reasonable explanation. An airburst would do it. But notice what we have just described: a flash of heat generated from above, intense enough to turn sand into glass across a wide area. That is also a precise description of a nuclear airburst. The question is not whether such heat is possible. We know it is. The question is what produced it, and whether, in at least some cases, the source was not a rock from space, but something made by intelligent hands. This is where the story stops being about physical evidence and becomes something far stranger. Because the ancient people of the Indian subcontinent left behind a description of exactly this kind of weapon, in writing, in extraordinary detail. The Mahabharata is one of the longest epic poems ever written. It is a foundational text of Hindu civilization, composed and compiled over many centuries, describing a great war between two royal families. Most of it reads like mythology: gods, heroes, moral lessons, vast battles. But scattered through the text are passages that describe the weapons used in that war, and those passages do not read like mythology at all. They read like the eyewitness account of a nuclear explosion. One passage describes a weapon called the Brahmastra. When it was deployed, the text says it was a single projectile charged with all the power of the universe. It describes an incandescent column of smoke and flame as bright as 10,000 suns, rising in all its splendor. It describes the weapon reducing an entire region to ashes. It describes the bodies of the dead being so burned that they were unrecognizable. It describes the hair and nails of survivors falling out. It describes food becoming poisoned. And it describes warriors throwing themselves into rivers to wash the invisible contamination from their bodies. The text goes further. It describes the weapon as an iron thunderbolt, a gigantic messenger of death. It says that after the blast, the sun seemed to waver in the sky, and the earth shook, scorched by the terrible heat of the weapon. It describes elephants burned by the heat, running in terror, rivers boiling, birds turning white and dropping from the air, hair and nails falling out, food poisoned, an invisible contamination that survivors desperately tried to wash away. That is radiation sickness. It was described in detail in a text composed thousands of years before anyone on Earth was supposed to know that radiation existed. How does an ancient poet describe the precise symptoms of radiation poisoning? Symptoms that would not be medically understood until the 20th century, unless he was describing something he, or someone before him, had actually witnessed. The weapon is only half of it. The same ancient texts describe the machines that carried these weapons. They are called vimanas. In the epics, vimanas are flying vehicles. Some are described as chariots of the gods, others as flying palaces, large enough to carry many people, capable of traveling vast distances through the air and even into the heavens. In some texts, the descriptions go further. They describe vimanas powered by a force contained within them. They describe the sound they made, a roar that filled the sky. They describe aerial battles fought between these machines, weapons fired from one craft to another high above the ground. One passage describes a vimana arriving on a beam of light, then rising until it shone like a comet in the night sky. Another describes a craft that could become invisible, appearing and disappearing at will. And there is a specific text, the Vaimanika Shastra, that claims to describe the actual mechanics of these craft, how they were constructed, the materials used, the methods of propulsion, the way they could maneuver. Now, the Vaimanika Shastra is controversial even among those who take the Vimana question seriously. It was reportedly produced in the early 20th century, said to have been received through a form of psychic recall of an ancient lost text. Scholars who have examined it concluded the described craft could not actually fly, so we set that particular text aside. But the Vimanas of the older epics from the Mahabharata and the Ramayana are a different matter. They are woven deep into the oldest layers of these texts. They are not a modern invention. They were described consistently across centuries of Indian literature as flying machines that carried gods and kings through the sky and rained destruction from above. And the weapon that rose like 10,000 suns was, in the texts, deployed from exactly such a machine. A flying craft, an aerial weapon, a flash of light, a region reduced to ash, survivors dying slowly as their hair fell out. Either this is the most prophetic coincidence in the history of literature, or it is a memory. It is important to be fair to the conventional explanations. They are not foolish, and they are not all wrong. The vitrified forts of Scotland may have been burned deliberately, perhaps in rituals, or in the destruction of a defeated enemy's stronghold, with techniques we have not fully reconstructed. The Libyan desert glass is, by scientific consensus, the product of a natural airburst or meteorite impact tens of millions of years ago, long before any human civilization. The collapse of the Indus Valley civilization is best explained by climate change and the shifting of the rivers that sustained its agriculture. And the famous radiation claims about Mohenjo-daro skeletons cannot be traced to a verified, peer-reviewed scientific study. Taken individually, each anomaly has a conventional answer. But here is what the conventional view does not explain well. It does not explain why a poet thousands of years ago described radiation sickness with clinical accuracy, hair falling out, food contaminated, an invisible death that pursued survivors into the rivers. It does not explain why the skeletons of Mohenjo-daro were found unburied in the streets, killed instantly with no weapons, no attacker, and no signs of the slow decline that climate collapse should produce. It does not explain why the same culture that built the most advanced sewage system of the ancient world vanished, all at once, leaving its dead lying in the open. And it does not explain why the man who built the first nuclear bomb reached, in that moment, for the words of an ancient Indian scripture, as if the language to describe what he had just done already existed and had been waiting for thousands of years. Each anomaly has an answer, but the answers do not speak to each other, and the pattern they leave behind points somewhere the textbooks will not go. Consider what we are actually looking at. A city, 5,000 years old, more advanced than anything around it, whose people died in the streets in an instant. Layers of that city showing signs of heat far beyond what fire can produce. Glass forts across Europe melted by a heat no one can reproduce. Desert sands turned to glass by a flash from above. And ancient texts, written by people who supposedly knew nothing of atoms, describing a weapon brighter than 10,000 suns, deployed from a flying machine that burned a civilization to ash and left its survivors dying of an invisible sickness. None of these things on its own proves a war fought with nuclear weapons in the ancient past. But together, they form a picture that mainstream history has no comfortable place for. A picture in which a technological catastrophe, a real one with real weapons, may have happened on Earth long before our own. A civilization that rose, reached for a power it could not control, and erased itself so completely that all we have left are the glass, the bones, and the warnings written into its songs. When Oppenheimer watched the first bomb rise over the New Mexico desert, he did not reach for a modern phrase to describe it. He reached back thousands of years to a text written by a civilization that may have seen the same fire before him. Now I am become death. Perhaps those words were not a metaphor. Perhaps they were a memory, carried across millennia, waiting for the day humanity would build the weapon a second time and finally understand what the ancients had been trying to tell us all along. What do you think turned those cities to glass? And do you believe a technological war could have been fought on Earth before recorded history? Tell us in the comments below, and remember to hit the like button for more ancient mysteries. Keep your minds open, and until we meet again.